they're adults. Plus they understand the concepts. This is how Scripture was meant to be understood. Now, once you realize that you can't ignore the language or the context. Because if I'm standing there hearing something read in a public reading, and it says, do not incline after the majority to pervert justice, I'm not going to ignore the words do not at the beginning and ignore the words pervert justice at the end. I'm going to hear them within their context. And based on that, I'm going to know how to keep them and observe them. So this is we were clearly not meant to take things out of context. I mean, that should be obvious, but to some people that's not obvious. Now, why is it that they had to learn about this in the public reading? Why couldn't they just open up their books, open up their Bible every night before they went to bed and read a chapter of the Bible, right? Of course, we all know that the chapters aren't the original part of the Bible, so everybody know that. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 13th century, is the one who established the chapters. Before then, there were no chapters until the 13th century in any Bible, in any language. Now, the original Torah or instruction that Moses gave was a scroll, the same type that Keith talked about. It was a scroll written out on parchment that to write a book like that, took an entire flock of sheep, approximately 50 sheep, to produce a Torah scroll. That's a huge amount of money, or a huge amount of resources, really, because they didn't really exactly have money in our sense. I imagine 50 sheep it takes. And then it takes barrels and barrels and barrels of ink. This isn't just something I go to the corners to Staples and buy, give me a pad of paper and pens. No, they had to produce the ink. And they had to pay someone to sit for at least a year and write the scroll. So it required a great resource, vast resources, in order to produce a copy of Scripture. I mean, that's inconceivable to us today. You go to any hotel room, and there's a copy of the Scripture there. Unless you go to a Marriott, then they have the Book of Mormon, but that's a different story. In most hotels, do they do that in Canada? They have Gideons in Canada? We'll check in our hotel room if they have the Bible. I mean, imagine that. It's become so mundane today that even the hotel rooms have them. Back then, it took a king, the wealth of a king, in order to produce a copy of Scripture. And that's why they had to come once every 7 years to hear it read. Otherwise, they wouldn't know it. They might have heard, I heard from that guy, it says in the Bible. If you didn't come at that ritual every 7th year, then it would be missed. We actually have a gentleman here in the audience who has dedicated his life to trying to figure out when that 7th year is. Because part of that, you want to raise your hand, Joseph? Part of that cycle of the 7 years has actually been lost to mankind. And so this gentleman here has done extensive research. He met me in Jerusalem and gave me a box this big, I'm not exaggerating, and I opened it up and it was A4 pieces of paper, thousands of pages of research that he'd done, trying to determine when the sabbatical cycle was, as part of what hopefully will be the restoration soon. The correct way to interpret Scripture, as I understand it, is to look at things in their context, look at the language. The 5 books of Moses, certainly the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew. As Keith mentioned, there are certain chapters in Ezra and Daniel that are in Aramaic, and there's actually one verse in the book of Jeremiah in Aramaic. But most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and if you want to understand it, you have to understand the language it was written in. Understand that original language. Then you also have to look at things in their context. Those are textual context, meaning the words in that verse, in that chapter. There's also the historical and cultural context. I'll give a quick example of what I mean by historical and cultural context. So there's a commandment in the Torah that appears 3 times, and it says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What a strange commandment. What does that mean? And that's what the rabbis asked 2,000 years ago. They said, what could that mean? Don't boil a kid in its milk. Why would he tell us about boiling? And a kid, of course, is a young goat. Why would the Torah tell me, why would God care if I boil? Why would I even do that in the first place, that God would have to come and tell me not to do it? It makes no sense. And so they said, it doesn't mean don't boil a kid in the milk of its mother. What it means is don't eat meat and milk together. And if you actually go to any kosher hotel in Israel, I've heard this from many Christian tourists, they go to the hotel nice dinner, which is, the meat. They have their steak or they have their schnitzel. That's the standard Israeli food. And they ask for coffee, and there's no milk. They say, sorry, we can't give you milk because this is a kosher hotel, even if don't keep kosher. The entire hotel is a kosher establishment. And the rabbis teach us we can't mix meat and milk together. And they quote the verse, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, when I hear do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, what do I think it means? Let me think if I can figure this out. Well, one of the things you have to look for is the historical and cultural context. Because it sounds weird. What does that mean? I mean, the reason the rabbis interpret it as this symbolic kid is any meat and milk, mother's milk is any milk, is because they don't understand the historical and cultural context here. Now, there's a very important archaeological site in Syria called Ras Shamra. It was discovered over 100 years ago, actually. And in Ras Shamra, they excavated and they found all these documents written in an ancient dialect of Hebrew, or a language very similar to Hebrew. And essentially, the documents from Ras Shamra are the Canaanite Bible. That is the Canaanite version of how the world came into existence. All kinds of things about Baal. We all know about Baal from the Old Testament, that we're not allowed to worship him. Well, who is Baal? Like, what do we really know about him from the Bible? Almost nothing. So in the Canaanite version, in the Canaanite Bible, it tells us about Baal, who's the husband of Asherah, and he has a few other wives. He was a polygamist, and one of those wives is his sister, and all kinds of weird things there in these Canaanite documents. And one of the things they tell us is that the goddess of fertility, who was one of the three wives of Baal, is Ashtoreth. She's usually known in English as Ishtar or Easter. That they would boil kids in the milk of their mothers as a fertility offering to Ashtoreth, to Ishtar. This was something we see in the ancient documents from Ras Shamra, from the ancient Canaanites. So when God came in the Torah and commanded us, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, he was referring to that pagan fertility ritual. And you could say, okay, he doesn't necessarily mean it literally, but then the application would be he means all pagan fertility rituals do not participate in. That's the principle there. It has nothing to do with eating meat and milk together. There's actually a joke that the rabbis tell, or one of my rabbinical friends told me this in any event. And it's based on the concept that the rabbis essentially look at Scripture as a divine code. And they say if something appears 3 times, it means 3 different things. Now, I would think if it appears 3 times, word for word, well, why would something be repeated? Why do you think? Anybody have any idea?
Emphasis.
For emphasis. And why would you need to emphasize it? Well, just read it and underline it, right? Well, they're hearing it, remember? And if they're hearing it once every 7 years, if something's important, then he needs to repeat it. And that's an important principle. Look at the things in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses that are repeated. I won't go into all the details. But think about something like the 10 Commandments, how many times we hear about those specific commandments. They're repeated at least twice the entire 10, and then specific ones are repeated even more than that. Now, if it says 3 times word for word, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, then presumably it means do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, and he's emphasizing it. But the rabbis say that if it says that 3 times, it means 3 different things. And those 3 different things are, the first time is don't eat meat and milk together, don't cook meat and milk